Hello, everybody in the IATSA community. Thank you very much for joining us for the next session of our Secure Connections podcast. My name is Ryan Morris. I'll be your host and interviewer today. We have a great guest here who knows her stuff, and we're very glad to get some insights and some wisdom from Amy Luby. Now, I've known Amy for many years as we have walked the path through this interesting and quirky world we call the technology channel. But for those of you who don't know Amy, I'd love to have you, Amy, if you would, tell us how you got into the business of technology. How did you get into security? What do people need to know about you?
Oh, gosh. Well, thanks, Ryan. It's great to be here. So me, in a nutshell, I've been around in the channel for about 26 years. A good portion of that, 16 or so of those years, I was an MSP, pivoted into a master MSP at one point. So I did that for a good long time. And then around 2010, actually toward the end of 2010, came over to the dark side and have been working with vendors or distributors, helping to build their channel programs, and primarily working with SaaS security software companies.
Okay, so in other words, been there, done that, and people should take your advice on how to do this stuff. There are 1,000 opinions about what's going on in cybersecurity these days. I have a little rule of thumb that I've mentioned before in some situations. Those of us who've been selling this for a long time, we talk about cybersecurity just like it's regular dinner time conversation. The real world does not, right? People who don't do what we do for a living, it's a good thing when they don't know what's going on in cybersecurity because it's not regular dinner time conversation. These days, it is. It's all over the news. It's in the headlines. Restaurants are, getting hacked, and hospitals and shutting down pipelines all over the country. I think that kind of gives us an added level of urgency. I'd love to hear your point of view, like working in it every day. If somebody says, well, what about cybersecurity? What should I care about? Where do you begin? Like, what's the beginning point of how do we get people to take this seriously?
Well, you know what, frankly, I think more people than ever right now are taking it seriously. I think, if you were to go back even just 5 years, maybe not so much. Maybe it's like, who wants my data? Nobody really cares about my data. So, why do I need to spend on this? But today, just during COVID alone, we saw a 300% spike in cybercrime. That's just massive. There's, for service providers themselves, there's too many security products. There's too many breaches happening. I mean, ransomware attacks happen every 14 seconds. Like, I mean, we cannot close our next ticket, right, before another one happens. So the whole premise, right, of being an MSP is being proactive. And I think what's happened to security has really pushed us back into a reactive posture. And that's the challenge today is how do we get stood up, if you will, fortify our security posture and become proactive again. And given the complexity of what's happening today with, the attack surfaces expanding, we've got folks working from home on all kinds of consumer devices and products, accessing corporate networks. Help desks have been quite overwhelmed with how do I do this? How do I do that? The idea of being able to simplify and focus on the core deliverable, if you will, of the MSP today, which frankly is security. Because we really can't do anything with an end user client until we've addressed their security posture.
I think that's a fascinating observation, right? It is still surprisingly common in my conversations when I hear MSPs say, well, we're here to manage the network. We don't really focus on the security part. My question is, how can you have a network that's not secure and think that that's okay? Right. I mean, when you say 300% increase in cybercrime, that wasn't coming off a small number, right? It's not like we were 300% grown on 5 or 6 attacks that we're having. We were already at outrageous levels of complexity and attack vectors. And then we just multiplied that by 3 times. I don't know that you can react fast enough, right? I've been for years, I've been a big fan of artificial intelligence in cybersecurity, right? Letting the machine help us figure it out. The bad guys also have artificial intelligence, right? They're using those same engines to bring new attacks to market every bit as fast as we can react to them. I think you're onto something that is, it's not just a style question. I think it's a basic strategy question. It has to be proactive, not reactive. If your strategy is defensive, I predict you're probably not going to win.
Right. Well, and you can't win, right? You've got to go into any client situation assuming breach, assuming it's already happened or it's happening or it's gonna happen. That's kind of the only way to really approach it. And you're right. Maybe 15 years ago, we were good enough to manage the infrastructure, just manage the network, deliver a managed firewall and some email security and some antivirus, and we've checked those boxes and we're pretty good to go. That's just no longer adequate. And frankly, probably irresponsible. I'll throw that out there. If we aren't addressing security first, not only is that client at risk, but so is the service provider. Mm-hmm. And that's even more clear today than it's ever been. Yeah. We've got regulation coming. We've got reporting, if you will, coming. I mean, this is going to happen, and we have to be prepared. So, no longer is it okay to react to any of this. We've got to get into a proactive stance. We've got to be offensive about it, and we can't just rely on kind of old technologies. Automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of this is critical to getting us back into a proactive stance. And we need to start relying on technology to do that for us.
Yeah, and see, this is the thing, right? I'm very happy. I'm optimistic, actually, at some of the developing technologies that I've been seeing in the last couple of years. I'll go back maybe 3 years as machine learning and AI engines in virus definition started to kind of become mainstream. That's encouraging. I'm like, okay, that's that. I think we might be able to do some good things there. But what I find fascinating is, there was a season when I got started in cybersecurity in like 1994, right? Was the first time I had a conversation with somebody about virus, malware, security protection. And at that point, the conversation was all about the endpoint. And then we figured out, well, the network matters too, right? And eventually we got there. And for the last 20 years, it's all been about the core and the network and, the firewall and all of the access controls, the things we do in the data center. The endpoint is desperately unprotected these days. Like, it's almost like the industry thought, well, come on, we solved the endpoint protection 20 years ago. You put in some antivirus, boom, you're done. I can't even imagine how few people out there these days would legitimately pass a test to say your endpoints are protected, that it's a robust layered approach to protection, that we could say check the box and go focus on something else. What used to be simple is now actually the complicated part. Where do you see kind of as you're thinking attack vectors, right? Is it more in the data center? Is it more at the endpoint? Where are you seeing the attacks?
Well, it's actually about data protection, regardless of where it lives, whether it's on the endpoint, whether it's in the data center, whether it's in transit, whether it's backed up somewhere. The whole idea is to protect that data, right? Traditionally, we very much relied upon our backups, right? So when something bad happens, we go to the backup, we restore it, we spend, the next 12 or 24 hours patching that newly restored backup, et cetera, putting it out in production. That's just no longer adequate. I mean, it's not adequate at all. So protecting data where it's at, through the use of modern technologies, AI, it is critical at this point.
See, I think
So
that
we can't really look at it, as protect the endpoint, protect the edge, protect the data center. It's protect the data.
See, I think that's a conversational approach that maybe our industry can start to make some real headway with customers, right? Because a lot of the people that are making these decisions or reading the news, just like we do, about all of these attacks that are going on, those people are not technically trained. They are not the IT department. It's the CEO who's saying, holy cow, we just saw this attack on this pipeline. What are we doing to protect? And they're making buying decisions without a technical background. So we need to figure out a way to tell this story without getting into the science, down into the weeds. Protect the data, not the device. I think that's a valid, A, like you said earlier, be proactive, not reactive, and B, focus on the data wherever it is, not the device. I think that's a good beginning for a conversation about how to get non-technical people to think we might actually be able to be okay.
Right. And, a lot of times I'll hear a service provider say, well, if I have a conversation about data protection with my end user, and my end user is typically a small business like I am, my end user is like, my data is not that important to anybody. Nobody really cares about, whatever I've got on my network. The idea is, well, one, yes, they do. And two, it's not just your data. You have client data there. And when that gets breached, that is a big problem, whether it's just a hit to your brand, whether it takes you offline, whether it makes you lose customers. So, you may not care about that customer data, but your customer does. And that's an important distinction in that conversation with those end users.
Yeah. And see, that's where this, for me, becomes, we said at the beginning, let's begin by saying, think about security first and then think about everything else that we do. It's amazing how many people don't already think that way, right? They're still thinking, well, I built the network, I'm managing this thing. Later on, when it becomes urgent or when we've got extra budget, then we'll come back and we'll talk about this stuff. I think of it in the spirit of, if anything you are doing in technology is not secure, you should not be doing that thing, right? Whether it's internal communications, whether it's the way we communicate directly to our clients, the way we process payment data. If it is not secure, don't do it. Now, it's a connected world. Like, yay for the industry, we're successful in getting people to move all of their workloads to the cloud. That's great, as long as they're paying attention to the security. I'd love to get your thoughts on how do we actually do the work of this, though, right? Because we know there's a million attacks and we know that there's all these technologies that are out there. These are recent technologies. And that old job posting that you would see, must have 5 years experience working with XYZ.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the tools we use weren't invented 5 years ago.
Right.
End users don't have humans who have these kinds of skills. How do we solve that problem in terms of whether it's us getting educated or educating our customers? How are we going to solve that knowledge gap at the pace that this technology is accelerating?
Well, there's a couple answers, and it depends on who you are. So from the vendor perspective, right, how do we provide the right tools for our partners to use? If you look at the case of Acronis, we've been around for almost 20 years and are very well known for our backup and disaster recovery platform. But about almost 10 years ago, actually, we doubled down on artificial intelligence. we started working and said, hey, we see where this is going. Backup is dying. We need better tools. We need to deliver better tools, modern tools, using modern automation and integration to our partners. So I would say to a service provider, one thing you can do is start looking at your vendors this way. What are your vendors doing? And are they modernizing? Are they using modern technologies and techniques and protocols, all of that, to deliver better solutions? The MSPs, from that perspective, I mean, you've been around for as long as I have. We've been talking integration and automation for the last 20 years since the MSP model has emerged. Today, it's not a wish list checkbox. It's an absolute need. We cannot fight the sophistication of cyber criminals, if you will. I mean, these are massive organizations utilizing bleeding edge technology. We've got to be able to at least keep pace. So choosing the right tools, the right vendors to work with that are utilizing those modern technologies is a critical component.
See, I think one of the most interesting ironies in our industry, right? As an MSP, we strive for standardization. Years ago, we all studied in the industry of managed services to learn that if you're trying to manage 50 customers with 50 different technologies and different configurations, the complexity will overwhelm all of us. Standardization becomes a good thing, except that if standardization becomes the reason why you won't adopt newer, more modern technologies, well, I've got it baked in. This is my standard configuration. Well, there's a new and better tool. It's not standard. That's not what we use. Mm-hmm. As soon as you lose that storyline and you start to use standardization as the reason not to adopt automation or AI, well, that's not the way we do it around here. I think you're about to very rapidly lose the trust of your customers, right? Standardization is great for operational effectiveness, but you have to be the first one in your market to adopt these new technologies. You know, if a customer comes to you as the managed service provider and says, hey, I've been reading a lot about AI, what do you think? Oh, well, we're not doing anything with that. That's not on our agenda because that's not standard. My guess is they're not going to trust you with a lot of their critical systems and data, right?
Right.
That creates some complexity. How do you manage the change to your own tool set, right? When you were an MSP, right? Somebody comes to you with a new pitch, new RMM, new PSA, new whatever. Ripping it out and replacing it in your stack that you use to serve hundreds of customers, that ain't easy. How do you manage that stuff?
Well, let's look at it this way, Ryan. You know, we have MSPs have always had their core tool set, their PSA, their RMM, whatever their email security is, whatever their managed firewall is, their help desk, their NOC service. It's a core tool set, right? To deliver those services. Those tools have been around for, depending on who you're using, almost 20 years, okay? They think about the core code, where that started, right? And how much has been added on since. You look at security today, there's literally thousands of tools out there. There's new vendors popping up all the time. Most partners report that they're using 6, 7, or 8 different security tools on top of their core stack, okay? Think about the operational inefficiency of that service desk today, going from console to console to console, having to deploy 4, 5, 6 or more agents on a device now when you enable a new partner, right? Or a new client, I should say. Also look at it from, you want to talk about modern technologies. We always ask as MSPs, if we're looking at a new vendor, do you integrate with my PSA or my RMM tool? It's one of the first questions. Well, think about, I don't want to call it legacy, but traditional integration. It's through API calls.
Yep.
Every API call is a potential vector for breach. Think about how many tools you have sitting in your stack that have API calls going on all the time, right? And then we've all been in that vendor hell situation where somebody updates their software and it breaks integration with everything else, right? And then you're scurrying around. The need for modern integration and automation is critical. And it's really, in my opinion, the only way to combat the progressive cyber criminal activity that's happening today and that will continue to happening. I mean, it is growing at a phenomenal pace.
Well, and that's the thing, right? I will refer to it as job security for MSPs. Your customer does not have people on staff now who know how to use modern technologies for automation, right? In cybersecurity. They don't know multiple platforms for multiple layers of your stack. They're keeping up with that and with systems administration and quality control and service management and the profit calculations internally. And then, like you said, all of that integration. There's not an IT department out there, especially where we sell in the mid-market, in the SMB. They don't have enough humans. They don't have enough resources, enough training to be able to keep up with all that stuff. Managing the chaos is kind of our job description, right? You have to keep up with that. You said something that rings a bell for me 100%. Data, if data is the point, security to keep people out of it is not enough. The backup is absolutely essential. Right. My second job in technology all those years ago, I grew up at a tape backup company, right? Not the sexy part of the industry, not the cool cutting edge stuff. Even back then, tape was old and tape was outdated, but it's still out there, right? Like there's still people who use this stuff because there's a use case and a purpose for it. I've spent decades telling people stories about why backup and recovery is absolutely essential in a business operation. It's still not nearly well penetrated enough, right? I don't think enough end users have figured out how to solve the backup problem. But if you're not solid on the backup, no matter what you do in cybersecurity, it won't be enough. And if you're solid in cybersecurity, both of these things are absolutely mandatory to go together. I mean, you guys are doing that from a product set, right? Like you said, the legacy is that you grew up in backup and then became the automation security side of things.
Right.
Do you see the world of MSPs internalizing that combination of backup and security? Those aren't two separate disciplines. That's the same solution.
Oh, it all goes together. I mean, backup is the reactive part. Backup is or restore is what you do after something bad has happened. Okay.
Yeah.
Like it's your last resort.
This guy already fell.
Yeah. Like things are really, really bad right now. And Acronis understood that early on. And when I mentioned we doubled down on developing artificial intelligence type technology within our platform, I mean, we were the first to put what we call active protection into our backup. I mean, we did this almost 10 years ago, which means our backups look for and find malware, bad stuff that's sitting in the backup, and we remove that. We have something called active restore. So when you're bringing a backup back online into production, we're looking at it from a perspective, okay, what's in this backup that could be bad, right? Malware, whatever. But also that backup happened at some point in time, whether it was a day ago, a week ago, a month ago. There have been all kinds of patches that have come out for the operating system and the third-party applications, all that stuff. So we're actively patching it. So when it actually comes online, you've got a production-ready environment. Normally what happens, you bring that back, backup, you bring the backup online, and then you spend hours and hours and hours actually getting it ready for production. So that technology has been there for a decade, right? We've just taken it a whole step further. When I talk about modern integration and automation, placing a whole suite of security tools on top of that backup platform So basically now you've got prevention, detection, response, recovery, and forensics in a single platform, single agent solution. You have completely eliminated the API vectors, right, of all that extra stuff. And then you've injected a serious level of operational efficiency into your service desk, because your engineers learn a single platform, right? Have a single place to go to manage all of that. So, what we're seeing is our partners are cutting their costs and their administrative overhead for security by 50%.
See,
That's huge right now.
That is massive, because, and I mean, I know that you think this way as well, because we've had this conversation in years past, that you can solve the technology problem. That's good. But if you can't run the business around the technology, you're going to be doing it very briefly, right? We have to be both answers here. We have to be good at solving the technical problems of protecting people's data, managing their networks and all their applications and infrastructure. But no matter how good you are at that, if you can't do it at a profit, that's a very expensive hobby that you won't be able to sustain for a long time. I find our industry, I've often said, I have no worry about whether an MSP can learn a new technology, right? New releases coming out every day, whole new platforms of technology. We do this for fun almost, right? Like, those of us in this industry, we do this because we enjoy it. Mm. We can learn any new technology that you bring to us. I don't have any fear on that at all. Can we do this in a profitable way? Can we actually maintain the operational efficiency to make a margin? Can we bring in enough new customers to stay ahead of those competitive pressures in the market? As you look at your space, right, doing what you do in the communities out there, how much of your time are you spending talking about technology versus the business side of things? Like, are you seeing the business conversation rise up? Are people focused there?
Yeah, they are. They are. I mean, I think if I were to break it down, it's probably 50-50. I mean, we, as vendors and in the sales process, we're always like, all right, let's try to keep the conversation from going too technical, because if we go down that rabbit hole, we're not really talking value. And it's the same thing with the MSP conversation with the end user, right? Let's not get too technical, because we're not necessarily selling a tool, we're selling a solution, and there's value in that solution, whatever that value is. So for me, I mean, in my role at Acronis, I'm not compensated on sales. Like, that's not my job. So I kind of have more freedom, if you will, to talk about value, talk about building a better business. What are the things that you can do as a business owner to tweak this, pull this lever, and derive more profit out of what you're doing? Right now, what we're seeing is, first of all, during the pandemic, almost 95% of companies globally bought new technologies to deal with work from home. I mean, think about just that spend. That's massive spend. Most of it was spent in the SaaS arena, right? So they're buying. The other area where they're buying is security tools, okay? And what organizations are reporting back is they're saying, we have tons of tools. We don't have the headcount to utilize them, right? Because there's 4 million open recs right now globally for security professionals.
Yeah.
Like, and that's not going to get solved anytime soon. And number two, the tools that are being used today for security, they're only utilizing about 60% of the features and functionality of them. So you've got tools sitting on the shelf that aren't even being used, but then the tools they are using aren't being fully utilized. So you've got this glut, this problem of too much going on. And that's kind of what I was alluding to in the very beginning of the conversation, which is we need to simplify. but simplify with modern tool set.
Yep.
And that's the key there, is that automation and integration to drive that profit margin.
Yeah, well, and see, I think you're on to the key of the issue here, that our industry, tools won't solve the problem, right? No matter how advanced, no matter how capable, the feature function is in our technology. If you don't have a human who's got the ability to use all of those features, it's nice trivia that you have an extra 70 features that you don't actually utilize. That's nice. But if you don't have integration that can manage the complexity, more function, more advanced tools, it's actually just going to make that complexity problem worse. You're actually going to lose ground in our ability to manage this stuff. And like you said earlier, we don't have the luxury of being good some of the time and then going back in and like, well, we were focused on internal things. We weren't really paying attention to all the threat vectors because we were integrating our tools. We don't have that luxury in the industry. The simplification, or at least to the customer, the appearance of simplification, right? As an MSP, our job is, I'm going to take all that complexity, all that hard stuff. You don't have to worry about it. I've got it. That's why you hired me. You go back and run your business. I'll solve all of this complicated stuff. That's where, manufacturers, software developers in the vendor community, no matter how much you build a great tool, you can't solve the industry, the end user's problem without the MSPs. So I love to see that you are, the fact that a vendor has somebody like you, whose job is not measured by sales, but measured by the health of your community. Mm-hmm. I think that's a modern thing that we didn't see 10 years ago in the industry.
Right. No, 100%. We can't, the idea of having a mutually beneficial relationship, we have to live that. And the only way to live that is to actually help our partners run better businesses. The growth or the consumption, if you will, that we worry about as a vendor, the consumption of the software is going to come with healthy partners who are running a healthy business that's growing. And so it's in everybody's best interest to work together like that, to build a better business. We grow, they grow. But in order to do that, you kind of have to, put your money where your mouth is and start focusing on your partner community and making sure they've got the tools, not just your software, but the tools that they need to grow a better business.
See, and obviously there's a million, now that you've got this idea, how do you go execute, right? There's a lot of detail in that conversation that we'll have to follow up with in a future situation. But my one of my main takeaways here from talking to you today is, I think that the MSP community needs to raise their expectation of their vendor community, right? If your vendor is not, like you said, bringing modern technologies and is not investing in your business success, you should go talk to somebody who is, right? Like, we should raise that expectation. If all you bring me is great tools, but not that support to make me thrive, that's not good enough anymore. And I think that we're a mature enough space that we need to kind of step up what we do from the vendors to the partners, and partners need to raise that expectation.
Right.
Big thought from you, right? As we're kind of wrapping up here, if you had a recommendation for an MSP who is in the thick of the security challenges right now, what would you give them the advice to go do right now to make it work better?
Oh gosh. I think I would reiterate what I'm saying. I think, we spent a long time over the last 15 years or so, Ryan, talking about, hey, don't focus so much on your tools, get the right tools in place, but look, it's all about the process. It's how you execute, etc. Today, with the complication of cybercrime and what's happening and how fast it's happening, the the increased number of workloads, the threat vectors, the threat surface that's expanding. I mean, we can't do it without the proper tools. We can't protect data without the right tools in place to protect that data. It's happening too fast. So I would say be open to evaluating modern technologies and be open to looking at your vendors with that kind of critical eye and say, you know, is my vendor worried about selling me something that doesn't necessarily fit the modern challenges that my clients have today? That's the question I would be asking all vendors, including Acronis. I mean, I'm saying that across the board. Ask that question. Are they focused on moving forward, developing modern technologies with modern approach to help me solve those problems? That's what I would
See. I think
be very open to that.
Yeah, and again, as an industry, we tend to be change cautious and stability centric, right? We want a rock solid set of APIs, a standardization in our protocols. That's all good until it causes you to shut off the evaluation of these modern tools. I think that's it's an evolution in our mindset more than it is in the tools we use. Just admit it. The world is changing too quickly. Your stack of tools that you're using isn't going to last for 5 years. Like, I wish it would, but it's not going to last for 5 years. If the last time you adopted a new tool was 5 years ago, I wonder how you're still in business.
Yeah, you're behind the 8 ball at that point.
Absolutely. Well, we could keep this going forever, obviously, because we've lived this for enough years that we've got tons of opinions and advice. If people want to continue this conversation with you, how do they get in touch with you? Who do they reach out to in the Acronis world? Where should they start to get some more detail from Acronis?
Well, in general, you can go to our website, right? And that's acronis.com. For me, if you want to get a hold of me personally, I'm amy.luby at Acronis. So either way is great.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Amy, very much for your time. We appreciate you kind of stepping out of the battles that you're doing every single day and taking some time to help educate the community. So we appreciate your time. We will look to have you back on again in a future conversation. But for everybody out there in the community who's listening to us, we appreciate you taking some time. Please participate in the conversation, right? If you found us on LinkedIn or if you're listening to us on one of the podcatchers out there, leave a comment, ask a question, tell us what we can do to keep this conversation as relevant and as valuable to you as possible. We love to get that interaction and feedback. So I'm out here as well, Ryan Morris. I am rmorris at morrismp.com if you have questions or comments to me, or find me on LinkedIn. So let's keep this conversation going. Amy, thank you very much for your time.
Ryan, you're a rock star. Thanks for all this. I love talking to you. Can't wait to see the IOTSA team, live soon, I hope?
In person, in the real world is what we're hoping again. So we're going to get back out there.